Welcome to Resilient. I'm Don Fancher, the global leader of Deloitte's forensic practice, and I get to be the host for this Resilient podcast series on the future of trust. And in this series, we are talking to leaders like you who are on the front line of building, maintaining, and even in some cases, defending trust in their organizations. We'll continue to explore what it means for leaders and institutions to strike the balance of transparency and mutual benefit of stakeholders, and how that influences actions that leaders can take to build trust. In today's episode, I am joined by a legal leader with an incredible story to tell. Martha Minow is a Harvard Law School professor, the former dean of Harvard Law School. She's been a CEO, a litigator. She's served on the board of directors, and she's also been a UN Commission chair. And for over 40 years, Martha has been shaping legal minds, advancing the profession, influencing legislation, and she's even worked with country leaders to help advance policies and conflict resolution where trust was desperately needed. During our conversation, we're going to also hear about her new book, Saving the News, which digs into how the government, social media, and technology are shaping media in the United States. We're going to discuss the kinds of initiatives that are needed if the First Amendment guarantee of freedom of the press continues to hold meaning in this 21st century we find ourselves in today. So without further ado, let's hear what Martha has to say. So Martha, share a little bit with us today about your career. I'm amazed at all the things that you've accomplished, and would love to just hear a little bit more from your own words about the career and the life that you've had in law and beyond.
Well, you're very kind. I've been incredibly lucky. I turned to law really because I was interested in improving schools. That had been my focus. I did graduate work in schools and school reform. And found that lawyers were very much involved in challenging the conditions of schools, whether it was on race or economic expenditures or discipline. So I went to law school and then actually did research on children and representing children. And somehow that landed me with the extraordinary experiences of being a law clerk, first at the Court of Appeals and then at the Supreme Court for my hero, Justice Thurgood Marshall. And then I actually had planned to be a government lawyer, a civil rights lawyer, but I ended up teaching and accidentally made it my career. So
I love that. You accidentally made teaching your career.
Yes, I found that I loved it, and that one of the extraordinary opportunities when you teach professional school students is that you can have a foot in practice as well as in theory and research. And along the way, I did. I've done a lot of litigation and work in legislation, a lot of nonprofit work, a lot of nonprofit board work. One for-profit board, and I became the dean, and therefore I became a CEO and learned a lot about HR and risk management and cutting budgets during the financial disaster, and it was certainly a whole new experience. So I've had really extraordinary chances, and I've learned a lot, and I guess that's what's kept me in my role now. My 40th year of teaching is that I get to learn something new every day.
And I love that. I love what you just said about that, because intellectual curiosity, I think, is one of the things that keeps us going as human beings. And it's so important for us. And I was going to ask you that. I mean, 40 years of a career. And in that career, you've already talked about a lot of the things that you've done, but you've done work with the UN. You've been a director of public companies, of not-for-profit organizations, obviously a dean. So as you said, a CEO. How have you seen all of those experiences impact you and even change the way you think about society as a whole, the role of law, and in the topic we're kind of talking about here today, or going to talk about, trust? What have you seen change over that period of time?
Well, it really has been a tumultuous period of time. We, as a country and as a world, We've gone through many crises, whether they're dealing with environmental issues, issues of racial justice, global wars, economic gyrations up and down, and having the chance to see these very challenging experiences from different vantage points has been just incredibly valuable to me. So to move back and forth across nonprofits, for-profits, to be able to actually to talk with alumni all over the world and get their perspectives. What I've seen is that we are living in a more challenging time in the last 10 years than the prior 30 years. There's more change. There's more disruption. In some senses, there's more opportunity, but there's also, in many ways, more uncertainty. And I think uncertainty produces anxiety, and people look for places to put their anxieties, and that often leads to blame and even to distrust.
There's no doubt about that. And before we jump a little bit more into trust, there is one area that I'm particularly curious about, and it goes with what you just said, because you talked about the advent of change, and without a doubt, in the last couple of decades at least, the amount of change from an innovation perspective, a technology perspective, has been so much more rapid than anything we've seen in the history of man. In fact, I've seen different statistics I'm talking about from a data perspective that on every year we're producing more data as a society than all of the previous years of the history of mankind. And when you're creating that kind of data, you have that kind of technology that's generating, it obviously, creates, like you said, huge opportunity, but huge challenges. And I know one of the areas that you've spent a lot of time in of late is legal and ethical issues on AI, artificial intelligence. Tell us a little bit more about the work you've done on that topic and how you see that advancing.
I really came to it from the opportunity point of view. So having done a lot of work on the access to justice for people who can't afford lawyers front, I found the great avenues opening up with AI and even more simple machine learning, just algorithms, to be able to help people who don't have access to a lawyer fill out forms, be able to respond to questions, start a lawsuit, defend a lawsuit, start a company, start a nonprofit. And that's what started me on this journey. But very quickly, I also saw dangers. I saw the dangers of the reliance on data that are themselves distorted or limited. Face recognition has been an area where that's definitely been demonstrated. Also, the use of AI by judges to decide who gets released from prison before a trial. Similarly, relying on data that is partial, and the algorithms may be using not the right factors, like likelihood of showing up for a hearing, which may actually turn more on the availability of childcare or transportation than danger to the community. So I've really become very interested in both sides, the opportunity and the challenges. And yes, for the last several years, I've been teaching classes, most delightfully, classes that are half law students and half computer science students. It's obvious to me that going forward, people with these different kinds of training have to be able to talk with each other, understand each other, collaborate, understand what they don't understand about each other's worlds. And it's been a revelation, I think, for everyone involved. I do think that there remain many, many exciting opportunities, but also challenges, and that requires more varied and imaginative collaborations.
It's interesting because a good friend of mine, Richard Susskind, you may or may not know Richard.
I do.
He wrote a recent book on that very topic, on the access to justice piece around online courts. I think the title is Online Courts and the Future of Justice. And I've been fortunate enough to do some work in that space as well, looking at analytics and how we can use analytics to help understand the situation that people find themselves in, and then match the legal community more appropriately to those that are otherwise would not have access to it. That's an interesting segue into this issue of trust. because there is so much distrust in the legal system. And a lot of it is because there's just a lack of awareness of how it even works. It seems to be this ivory tower perspective that many human beings just don't even understand the process to begin with. And they're so reliant upon attorneys or the system, judges, as you said, to walk them through that. And so when you think about technology, online courts as a possibility, talk about the role of law. Just as a legal professor and a legal professional, what role of law do you see in helping to advance not just the access to justice, but just advancing trust as a more general perspective for people, for institutions, and the like?
I taught a class not long ago that brought design thinking principles to exactly those questions. And it was, frankly, a wake-up call for me and my students to see how inadequately lawyers have thought about, if I dare say it, the user perspective, the client perspective, or for the unrepresented person, the unrepresented person's perspective. The legal system is supposed to be designed to produce security, reliability, and fairness and justice for everyone in society. But the institutions of the law, too much, have been designed for the benefit and comfort of lawyers. Whether it's the courthouse, which is set up with signs that use technical terms, so ordinary people have no idea what it means to be directed to probate, for example. What is that? And at the same time, the legal system, when it works, actually produces the security and justice that may involve the most important aspects of people's lives. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done within law, but also making the barriers to using law much less. You know, my school is one of many that have created clinics to not only to represent people in court, but also to help low-income people start their own businesses and to, you know, fulfill their dreams. Law should be a tool to help people achieve what they want. People who have money are able to come to lawyers to plan their affairs, to plan their bequest to their children, to plan their companies for the next generation. And people who are middle class, working class, poor should have the same opportunity. That may mean actually not paying a one-on-one lawyer to have bespoke services, and because it's actually not necessary. And AI holds great promise here.
That's great. And let's advance that even a little bit further, because you mentioned the role of institutions. So law plays a big part of that, but our government institutions are obviously hugely important. And we see government institutions flexing to having more involvement in people's lives, sometimes less. The geopolitical climate, everybody has their own perspective around that. What are you seeing in your perspective right now on the influences that the geopolitical climate has? And from that, what can regulatory government institutions and the like do to, again, continue to improve or try to work on this issue of trust?
Well, everybody hates the law until they need it. And I think that we've seen a lot of that unfolding during the COVID-19 experience. So most people really don't like regulations, but people really do dislike uncertainty even more. And to not know whether it's safe to be in one setting as opposed to another, whether it's lawful for an employer to require a vaccine. It's the uncertainty that I think is more disturbing. And actually, why should the clerk behind the counter at the drugstore be the one who has to tell a customer, please wear a mask? That's a very awkward and inefficient way to handle public safety. So having some rules that are clear and are not left to one-on-one interactions, I think takes a lot of burden off of people's backs. but it only works if people trust the source of those rules or see that they are actually achieving some benefit. And unfortunately, I think that there have been enough occasions for people to lose that trust or never have the chance to gain it in the first place. So, if there hasn't been a built up, if you will, social capital or belief in the reliability of the system, taking on faith that this is a new good initiative is often hard for people. It's true with doctors as well. It's true with accountants as well. Whenever there's a technical expertise, it can be helpful, but it can be opaque and therefore fail to convince people this is worthwhile.
Is transparency a part of that process in your mind?
So transparency, which is a fancy way of saying letting people know what's going on, can be incredibly important. But in the area of AI and indeed some other areas, sometimes it makes things worse. It's an old lawyer trick, sad to say, in the midst of litigation, if the opponent has asked for information, to give a data dump much more than the opponent can actually navigate. So the question is, how much information and of what sort? Is it navigable? And take, for example, an algorithm. Many people say the way to hold tech companies accountable is to demand transparency in their algorithms. Well, most of us won't know what to make of an algorithm. So
even those who wrote the algorithm won't necessarily know what to make of it, because that's the whole nature of machine learning and artificial intelligence. It begins to improve itself based upon the data that's being input into it and the way that the algorithm's written to continue to improve the way that information is analyzed.
Fair point. You got it exactly. And so transparency per se, it all depends of what and for whom and in what form. So it's absolutely the case that secrecy engenders distrust. And yet just giving more and more and more information doesn't build trust. So it's got to be information that can be scaled, it can be navigated. And actually underneath all of these discussions is relationships. Are there relationships that give people confidence?
Relationships are vital to all this. And really thinking about a little bit of your history, I'd love to take a bit of a turn and apply some things we're talking about here to an experience you had maybe 2 decades ago now. I know you spent some time with the UN, and I understand as a part of that time, you were involved in working with a commission post the Kosovo conflict, so late 90s, early 2000s. And as I understand, you met with leaders of countries to talk about the distribution of aid, how to help the people that had been involved in this conflict. These concepts, transparency, relationships, and the like, how did that come into play in your experience there? And what did you find perhaps worked or maybe didn't work as well in enhancing those discussions?
Well, thanks for that question. After the NATO intervention to halt what certainly seemed to be an unfolding slow motion genocide in Kosovo, the former Yugoslavia was exploding. Milosevic had an agenda that was violating a lot of people's human rights. Sweden, the government of Sweden, created a global commission to investigate whether the NATO intervention was itself lawful and what should be the future status of Kosovo. And I was lucky enough to be tapped for that commission. And we did, as you say, meet with a lot of people and people in the region, including ambassadors from the neighboring countries, corporations trying to solicit their support for rebuilding Kosovo. And what I heard over and over again, which was a surprise to me, was the number one issue was corruption. The ambassadors said, more important than rebuilding the city, more important than rebuilding anything, is to get the corruption under control, because Without that, any receipt of aid would not be directed in the right avenues. And also the corrosion of trust was so profound that the situation was dire. There could be a reigniting of the conflicts. So that for me was very revelatory. At the same time, I also learned something I should have known already. I mean, I am a lawyer, about how significant the reliability of the courts were. Again, many people on the ground said, look, we have to get the court system built back up. And I thought, isn't food more important? The housing? And they said, no, you have to understand, if people don't feel secure about where they're living or whether the salary they think they're going to get with a job is going to be theirs, we can't do anything. And we have a problem of if the judge is a Serb, that person's not going to be trusted by a Croat. We're so divided as a society. And so actually, one of the wonderful developments there was the volunteer activities of lawyers from around the world, police officers from around the world, to help rebuild the legal system and build courts that had representation of the different ethnic groups so that anybody coming in could have the sense, okay, I can trust what's going on here.
And take that to the next level, because you're having these conversations with government leaders, with institutional leaders, neighboring governments and the like. But when it comes down to the people on the ground, those individuals. So you've talked about they need to have the security in their housing. They need to have a better court system or have a trust in the court system and the like. So you can begin to put processes into place that over time can accomplish that. But what about the people on the ground at that moment who have no trust whatsoever? Did you talk about or see things that were done at that point in time to enhance trust that worked and might even provide some learning for us today?
That's so perceptive. Another related project that I engaged in was with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And I had these great, ambitious academic ideas about peacemaking and found that people who had been through terrible conflicts had trouble actually sitting in the same room together. And so that led us to actually develop workshops to help people understand how to run a meeting, how to sit in a meeting, and also to create projects where people didn't have to be in the same room. We had one project that was funded that created a threshing machine that had a schedule carefully organized so that people from different groups could use it at different times and not at the same time. But developing those capacities to have conversations, to sit in a room, to plan a project, that turned out to be very, very important yes, on the ground, building the predicates for trust. It's interesting. I had the chance to work a little bit in South Africa, just as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was coming to issue its reports. And I met with the commissioners and I asked them, what does reconciliation mean when you've had decades and decades of violent conflict? And Archbishop Tutu, who was the chair, had a very strong view that reconciliation was a very full and ample idea, very informed by his profound Christian faith. Alex Bahrain, who was the vice chair, also a minister, said to me, that's not what I think. I think reconciliation is I'm walking down the street and I see coming towards me someone who I know was in the secret police. And he sees me and knows that I was in the African National Congress opposing what he did. And we see each other and we walk past each other and we do not take up arms against each other and we go on with our lives. He says, that's reconciliation. And I have taken that conversation with me into so many other settings, including in my own community, that if we can just, coexist, that in many situations is an accomplishment, and have some experiences of going forward, not fixing the past, but going forward, and then build trust inch by inch by inch.
I love that. And it's a really simple response I'm going to give you. But to me, trust at the end of the day is putting the other person's perspective in your own mind every time. If you could really try to understand whether you're an institution or a government or just two people that are interacting with one another, trying to understand the perspective the other person has and then responding to that in an appropriate way would make a huge difference. And I've got 3 kids. They're all grown, but I feel like I'm constantly teaching them. And I know you do the same with in many different ways, clearly, but just trying to help them see things from somebody else's perspective, it can make such a huge difference.
It actually is a developmental challenge to come to see the world from another person's perspective. And there's very valuable educational work, with 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds on working on exactly that I actually think has a good translation for adults. I think that is 80% of trust, but there's at least another 20%, which is making clear that your interests are aligned or at least not adverse, at least on the issue that's directly confronting you. Because sadly, a torturer knows how to take the perspective of the other. So it's not enough just to be able to take the perspective of the other. It's also to signal and to deliver on the reality that we actually have shared interests. I'm taking your interests into account. I actually want to advance your interests. I do not want to disturb your interests. That seems really, really important.
It's interesting because it aligns really well with a lot of the research that we've done on the issue of trust. And it's very complicated, but you can break it down at its very base level around the way we see it, competency and intent. And you can have all the competency in the world. It's an absolute fundamental requirement to have that competency in whatever you're trying to do. But ultimately, it's around the intent that you have with how you're going to interact, how you're going to deliver, and what are the outcomes of that? Even if you have great intent, if you still put in, this goes back to the AI situation, if you put something in place that has a negative outcome for whomever is impacted, no matter what your intent was or your desires were, you can lose trust. And so it goes with what you're saying is how do you communicate it, but also that you do it in the right way with the right interest in mind.
Trust is fundamentally belief in the reliability or truth of a person or a thing or an institution, but reliability for what? I think that really it's reliability in delivering what it promises or what the person promises, but also preventing betrayals, intentional or unintentional. Absolutely. So I think it's just absolutely central. Again, talking with alumni all over the world, I found people in Europe, people in Asia would often say to me that they heard that their clients wanted an American-style lawyer. And I said, well, what does that mean? They said they want someone who will help them solve their problem, not just tell them what the law is. And that really sparked an interest for me about, well, problem solving is really at its best what professionals do. They help people solve their problems, but you can't help someone solve their problem if you haven't fully understood what the problem is. And it's not the name that the professional puts on it. It's not, I have a tort, or I have a securities and exchange regulatory problem. It's, I'm trying to achieve an end, or I'm trying to protect an interest. And so to really inhabit that's the task of the professional. And then to use the expertise to achieve that end or to mitigate the risks.
So let's take a little bit of a different angle now. When you think about transparency, you think about data, you think about information. One of the biggest impacting factors perhaps of that and has been for a number of years, for decades in our society, is news. It's news organizations and the information that they present. And you've got a new book and you call it Saving the News. And I think this is fascinating given the environment we're in right now. Tell us a little bit more about your interest in that subject, how that relates to these issues of trust that we've been talking about and the impact on society as a whole.
Well, I did write this book really out of concern that we can't have a democracy if people are not informed and share at least some part of their understandings of reality. And I think democracy is a pretty good form of government. I mean, it has all kinds of problems, but there are fewer problems than other forms of government. But it does depend on people actually being informed and having some shared sense of reality. And at the moment, we're living in a time when that is less and less true. And it is very much a creation of and exacerbated by social media and frankly, by the use of algorithms, by companies that understandably want to maximize their profits, but do so by maximizing engagement. And they find that if they hire psychologists will tell them, well, you want your users to be engaged and even to be outraged and to be emotional and to use data to escalate those kinds of feelings, and also to separate people, to have ads targeting people based on their demographics, for example, in micro demographics and their past viewing habits, which means that people don't see the same ads. And sadly, we now know that without closer watch, some of these practices lead to racial bias. They certainly lead to regional bias and separations. So yes, this is what took me to the news industry. Another way in which the news industry is in jeopardy in this country is the destruction of local news. We are every day losing jobs and people who are spending their time trying to gather and report news in local communities, leading what the Pew Charitable Trust research arm has described as leading to news deserts. Literally thousands of communities in this country that have no local news. And if you don't have local news, then you don't have someone telling you, that there's corruption going on in the mayor's office, or there's lead in the local water supply. So yes, I did write a book about this, and I think it's urgent, actually, to spend time as a community, as a society, to try to strengthen the news industry, to try to mitigate the divisions that are escalated by the social media practices. Otherwise, I really do fear, we talked earlier about my work in Kosovo and also my work in South Africa, other parts of the world where I've seen conflicts. I don't want to be, dramatic about this, but I have seen what happens when people don't share a reality and people actually divert their anxieties into fear or hatred of others who are their neighbors. I mean, in Rwanda, the use of media, radio, fueling hatred, led husbands to take up machetes against their wives, neighbors to kill each other. We have to come up with a way not to go down that kind of spiral.
Well, and we know, and you talked about bias. One of the most prevalent forms of bias is confirmation bias. And every single one of us as human beings, we're subject to that because we have our beliefs and we seek to find data that corroborates our own beliefs or reinforces our own beliefs. It's just human nature. Social media is doing that. What type of solutions might exist to begin to overcome this fracturing that we're seeing? And is there, in fact, a role that our government in the United States could play in assisting in this, or what even maybe more down to earth, what can we as individual human beings do to try to impact this? Because the news is so prevalent and it should be, and it's so important, but the way it's delivered and really back to that transparency issue is so important for getting it accurate and getting it right and broadening the perspectives of the individuals that are being communicated to.
Confirmation bias is such a challenge. The research now shows that when people are presented with a point of view that contradicts or differs with something that they believe strongly, they come to believe what they believed before even more so. So it's a very tricky issue. I do think, though, that there are things that government can do and that nonprofits can do, and indeed that all of us can do. One is to actually voluntarily try to seek out points of view that are not our own. Another is to actually strengthen the more reliable sources of news, whether they are local or national or even global, and the government can help do this. Even with tax rules. So yesterday, a Senator Cantwell, introduced in the Senate a law that would allow individuals to deduct from their taxes the cost of subscribing to a local newspaper, businesses to actually deduct from their taxes monies related to ads that they take out in local news, and also adjustments of payroll taxes for news organizations that hire new staff. That's an example, because that's a government policy. It's neutral, doesn't get close to taking a position on content, puts the decision-making in the hands of taxpayers, but it would strengthen reliable news, particularly in the local setting. I also think that, frankly, the tech industries that are behind the social media, it's time for them to grow up. You know, the Communications Decency Act has a provision called Section 230. It created an immunity for tech companies so that they are shielded from the liability that attaches to any other news organization or publisher. And it was done with the good motive of trying to nurture fledgling industry. Well, fast forward to today, we now have some of the largest companies in the history of the planet that are immunized in that way. I think it's time to grow up and treat them like other entities that are in the business and hold them responsible when there's defamation, when there's fraud, when there is misinformation that leads to harm. And I think that there are other ways in which holding to adult standards of responsibility, these tech companies could strengthen the environment for news. Among other areas would be to actually require them to make their terms of service agreements transparent, understandable, and enforceable. And so if they say that they promise that people can actually see their data, they make that available, and other features that currently are not the case.
So let's take that concept to leaders specifically. And so in order for these things to be accomplished, all the things you're talking about, the changes that could help enhance trust in society as a whole and with our institutions, it's going to take leaders that are actually willing to do that. Any thoughts on the types of skills or perspectives leaders need to have? And you worked with leaders in so many different realms, both legal, government, as a board member and the like. So what skills do we need as leaders to really begin to create this trust in a more holistic way?
Well, the first and most important one is listening. I think that the best advice that I received when I became a leader included the comment, don't be the first one to speak and don't do so much speaking. Listen and gather information. And try to understand where people are coming from. And that's just incredibly important for a leader. It's funny. I did sit down. I am an academic, and I read a lot of leadership books when I became dean. And I found that there were three kinds of arguments about how people should lead. One was lead as a cowboy, be the one on the horse leading the cows to their next pasture. The second was that one should be a shepherd leading the sheep. And the third was that one should be a beekeeper. This really came from the software industry, making sure that the bees have what they need and then leave them alone. And what really struck me was that these were all imagining that those being led are not human beings. And they seem to be missing the basic point that leading any organization that involves human beings means understanding human beings and talking with, respecting them and hearing from them and making clear that their interests and your interests are aligned. And that's true for clients and students and other constituencies as well. So listening is number one. Seeing the whole person that you're dealing with, whether it's someone who you're trying to recruit for a purpose or someone that you're trying to steer in your direction, see what their interests are and see if you can come to some kind of shared point of view. Another, I think, really important piece of advice that I would give leaders is to not be driven by your inbox, and you obviously have to be responsive, come up with ways to respond, but you could fill all of your days and more simply responding to what other people want. So to have some goals and be very clear, just a few, and to make the time to actually advance those goals. I mean, I found that setting up meetings where they're just regular meetings and they are routine, that fills the day. That doesn't actually move the ball ahead. But having a goal and even identifying one or two people as thought partners to advance that goal and make the meeting about that was a more effective use of my time anyway. And then just one more piece of advice about being a leader that I have found helpful is if you delegate. If you're not delegating, then deliver. And the thing that doesn't work is to be somewhere in the middle. Delegate, but hover and second guess. And that, I think, is just any organization is successful if there's force multiplication, if you're able to leverage the talents, the imagination, the efforts of other people. Even if you think that no one can do what you've done, what you have in mind as well as you would, if you're going to delegate, give people the running room to actually come up with a new idea, do it their way, give people feedback, be honest about it. But letting go of micromanagement is a very important task, I think, for leaders.
Empowering your team and empowering people is an amazing way to engender trust. They've got to deliver, and like you said, you have to ensure that that you're getting what you need out of them. But I couldn't agree more. Empowering them to do so and letting them do what you've asked them to do. That is a big part of building trust. I love that. So, Martha, I want to just wrap this up with a couple of more questions. One, because we are talking a lot about trust here today, and you've given us some amazing insights as to the issues of trust, the challenges with trust, the ways and the opportunities of enhancing trust. Let me ask you this question. Do you think trust is actionable? Is it something that we really can, as leaders, take action to enhance and to create or improve?
Well, I think not only is it actionable, I think it has to be a goal that is quite conscious and deliberate and measured and advanced. It's not something to be presumed. Trust has to be earned and re-earned and re-earned. It's true in a marriage, it's true in any relationship, it's true in organizations. You hope you build enough capital so that people will take on faith when there's a risky moment or a crisis moment. But that's a capital that has to be replenished all the time. And trust is always a two-way street. It's in every direction. So it's something that I think should be talked about and should be quite explicitly measured. We care about what we measure, and we measure what we care about. So if you're not measuring some indication about trust, then you're not caring about it. I learned a lot in some interviews I did with people in the military, both the U.S. military and the Israeli military, when I was doing a project on What's the relationship between subordinates and people higher in the hierarchy when there's an issue of illegality going on, whistleblowing, if you will, or obeying the illegal orders? And what I found there was that, at least in some units in the US military, they really had made explicit measurement of whether or not the people in the top were listening and were earning trust, and were creating a climate where people could raise questions. And if they didn't create a climate where people could raise questions, then this would not be a functioning organization in an era when increasingly what military actions are very decentralized and have to be nimble and have to move in relationship to changing circumstances that can't be commanded from, thousands of miles away. And I just was so taken with that because it actually even translated into issues about inclusion, gender and racial and sexual orientation inclusion, that if the commander was not rated well by people in the unit on those issues, there wasn't trust.
Wow. I love it. Trust has to be earned and re-earned, but you've got to continually add capital to that bank account, if you will, that asset, because there really is equity there. And couldn't agree more. Measurement is so key and important to anything we do. And that's hugely important. I love the example. And I see a lot of examples of good leadership and bad from our U.S. military personally. So, and I've read a lot of leadership books in that regard as well. And I think that's a great takeaway.
I think about it in the context of corporate compensation. I actually have a sister who's an expert in that area. I am not, but I've learned a lot from her. And if you pay your CEOs and your top staff, regardless of performance, well, then you're not really caring about performance, Yep, and if you pay regardless of their capacity to earn trust, to build inclusion, then you're not really caring about it. And if you pay regardless of their environmental protection actions, then you're not really caring about it.
So you made a comment, I would wrap it up with this, and you kind of opened up early in the conversation around over 40 years, how much turmoil we've been in, and certainly have been in the last 10 of those years. No more so perhaps than what we've been dealing with now for the last year and a half or so on this pandemic. But I love to end these podcasts with just a little bit of perspective on hope and optimism for the future. So when you think about where we are right now, all things we've talked about, the challenges, what does give you hope or optimism for our future?
Oh, it's young people. I mean, that's the great benefit of being a teacher, is that I am surrounded by young, imaginative, earnest, energetic people, and their talents, their insights, their questions are so extraordinary. Teach me every day, challenge me every day, and that absolutely gives me hope.
I love it. That's great. Martha, thanks for the time today. It was insightful and, more than that, just hugely enjoyable. So thanks so much.
I enjoyed it too. Thanks for the great questions and discussion.
Thank you. Martha, thank you for such a dynamic and incredible conversation. I frankly could have gone on for hours. Some of the things we talked about, especially your work in the UN as a researcher and a catalyst for trust, it was so insightful. And I have to tell you, the parallels for how to address trust issues in a post-conflict environment, they're so applicable to the challenges that we as leaders are facing today. I frankly love talking about also the advancements you're proposing on ethical and pragmatic use of AI. It's something that's so important to me, and I know it's important to all of our listeners, and the way that we can use that to benefit society and communities is truly impactful. The last thing to me is the importance of empathy and relationships. They truly are what engenders trust. Fundamentally, we can all build trust by putting the other person's perspectives in our own mind and use that knowledge to guide our actions. Great lessons for all of us. Thank you again for your time. Now, if you'd like to learn more about how leaders can build and maintain trust, I encourage you to visit our Future of Trust site on Deloitte.com. You can also listen to our Future of Trust series on the Resilient Podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Until next time, stay safe and remain resilient.